All right, good morning, everybody. I guess, yeah, as Becky said, it's still morning. Welcome to our Online Learning Hub series. Today we are going to be looking at the content area math specifically. And once again, I forget the title, so I'll let Todd introduce it when he gets there. But our speaker today is Todd Moyer. He's one of our training and consultant staff, and he focuses on the math content area, so many of you know who he is already. Before we do get started, just a few reminders. We're going to leave the meeting muted to avoid kickback and feedback throughout the presentation. During that time, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat box, and we will answer them as they come up or at the end. Once we get to the end of the session, we will unmute everybody and allow for question and answer via your microphone and back and forth with Todd and any of the other moderators are on the session here today. We encourage you to have your camera on for the duration of the meeting to help build human interaction and community. But please keep in mind this will be recorded, so if you do feel uncomfortable with your face being in a recording, you can turn your camera off. Today's session will be a short presentation followed by some question and answer. At the conclusion of the webinar, we will send a feedback form link in the chat, and we encourage you to fill that out for two reasons. The first is it gives us an idea of how we're doing, and the second is it provides you a little bit of accountability to show that you were here for today's session if at any point we would need that information. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Todd Moyer to take us away. Todd, go ahead. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
There we go. Well, good morning, everyone. So let's start out with, I'm going to share our first slide. So welcome to creating a lesson framework for mathematical instruction. What I'd like you to have ready for yourself is at least a pen and pencil, because you will want to jot down some notes as we go through this. We're also going to try to do poll everywhere. So I will give you that link in the chat room when we get to that slide. And so we can just try out a little poll for some additional interaction. So I'm going to give you about 17 seconds, get a paper and pencil ready, and then we're going to move to the next slide. All right, super. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 basic components of a mini lesson. If you're familiar with guided math or guided reading, it's the same concept. What we want to do with our students is start to have some brief lessons with them, make them tight, make them concise, so that we keep their attention using the screen, right? So online, we know that sometimes the attention span is going to drop a little bit. So we want to really tighten up our lessons, and especially for math, you know, as math layers one skill upon the other, we really need to maybe tighten up some mini lessons so that we can get the concept across to our students in a way that they're successful. Speaking of successful, here's your success criteria for today. That at the end of this session, I can name 4 components of a mini lesson. I can give instructional examples of each component, and I can explain what changes within the mini lesson structure. So take about 12 seconds, jot down some of those success criteria so we can keep them in mind as we go through. Three, 2, and 1. Super. So let's look at the 4 components. There's 4 components to one of those mini lessons that you'll be going to do in math. Again, extracting this from the guided math structure and format. The 4 components, you're looking for about a total of 15 to 20 minutes. That's for your instructional and practice part. You can always add additional practice or remediation after that. But for our lessons, you want to chunk them down into small pieces of information and small tasks. So within each delivery of a task, you have 4 components. You have an introduction, instruction, interaction. The interaction is the engagement with the task at hand. What are you going to have the students do? And that closure. I think oftentimes, even when face-to-face instruction, we forget about that closure part. Think about it this way. If we open up students to instruction, we have to close them also within that instructional period. So at the end of your 15, 20 minutes, you want to close them down. Especially online, we're going to be missing some of those physical and social cues that we have in a classroom that lets kids know we're transitioning from one task to the next one. So your closure online, I think, is really critical so that you help the students understand that now this lesson task is finished and we're going to be moving on to another task or another introduction. Structure remains the same. So you will always have an introduction, instruction where you do the direct instruction or inquiry based. You're going to have them engage with the information and you're going to have a closure. What changes over the lesson days or the lesson time periods is the time you allot to each of those components. So you have a total of 15 to 20 minutes for your instructional mini lesson. But as those kids become more adept at the task and more complex possibly in the engagement, your introduction will shorten and maybe your closure will lengthen. The important part though is that you have all 4 components there in each mini lesson. This is going to give structure to your lesson. It's going to have the kids a little bit more comfortable and they know what's coming up next. I compare it to what APL has said for years. Put the agenda on the board. Have those kids see what you're doing first, second, third, and fourth. I worked with a class online earlier this week, and I think it would have been really helpful, and I'm going to try it again on Friday, if we would have said to the kids, we're going to spend some time introducing the task. Okay, kids, now I'm going to give you some instruction. Watch how I model this procedure. All right, students, now we're going to have you practice one on your own. I think it's important that we call out in the beginning what structure we're going or what component we're using in the mini lesson as we go through it. That will start to get those kids some sense of security and stability as they start to learn with themselves online. So here's an example. Let's say I'm going to start out with a task. I'm going to start a new lesson, a new procedure. Maybe I'm going to introduce equivalent fractions today. My introduction, if I keep in mind 20 minutes, my introduction might be 4 minutes long on this day. It's an initial day. I might then go into some direct instruction, an I do process. So that might be 7 minutes as I show them some work. Now within that 7 minutes, of course, you can pause, check for understanding, have them do thumbs up, thumbs down, introducing that primacy recency effect. After about 3 minutes, I would change something in your instruction, either go to a picture, have them do thumbs up, thumbs down, so that they can restart their attention. And then you might do 5 minutes of interaction, right? To leave them feeling successful, you may give them just 1 or 2 fractions to create an equivalent fraction from, just so that you can check, let's check our work, and want to leave them successful. Your closing might only be 4 minutes, right? So that self-assessment you might do, view of what you accomplished that day is going to be short because this is the first day you've introduced the lesson. As you go on to lesson 2 and lesson 3, you can see the components are still there, except the time allotted in each of those components will start to change. I may really need those kids to watch me do a little bit more modeling on that day too, because from my formative assessment and my closure, you know, what went well, what do you still have questions about, I can garner information on how to best instruct the second day. Lesson 2 or day 2, if I move to a more inquiry-based lesson, I might give them several fractions and their equivalents on a whiteboard, on a screen. And now I may have them engage with that information, say, what patterns do you see? This is a great time, folks, with your online instruction to start pulling out some of those math practices of pattern seeking, justification, and explanation. In that instruction component and blending over into interaction, you could have the students work out an example, or you can show them an example. Now kick it up a notch and say, can you explain to me why this works? Can you explain to me why these 2 examples are the same, or what's similar about those 2? Lesson 3, right? I might be starting now to introduce a little bit more closure time because they've engaged in a more productive struggle during the interaction part with the material. As my lessons go on, my instruction or my interaction with the material may become more complex. Quantities might increase. Complexity and number of steps might increase. And so as that same lesson concept rolls out, your interaction is going to get a little bit more wide with time. So again, the 4 components are always there. What teachers forget about is they can adjust the times for each of those components. We get into this lockstep routine where each component is equally divided into, say, 4 minutes. We have to be more aware of our timing. I know myself, when I do either PD or I'm working in a classroom, the clock usually gets me, right? So right now, the best thing to do is when you're online, have a little post-it on your screen that says, here's about how long I'm going to spend in each of these components. You really want to be mindful of the time right now online. So let's try a poll everywhere. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I am going to copy the address for you, and I'm going to place it into the chat. And you should be able to click on that link, and it'll take you to a poll everywhere. And I'm going to start that poll. The first poll is going to ask you, which of the 4 components do you feel confident in your timing? Introduction is coming up. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I share my screen? Instruction. Backed out. Instruction part. Closure. Super. So let me share my screen again in case you didn't see that, because I'm not quite sure if this is how we're working this. So you can see on my screen, that's how we answered. 63% of us, again, think our introduction is pretty much on point. We know how to adjust that, and we're very mindful of the time. Instruction sometimes gets away from us. Absolutely. I think that's pretty common. As teachers, we really have to do a shift in our instruction, whether it's face-to-face or online, in that we have to have a brief, direct instruction and then start to pull back and let the kids productively struggle with math, finding some patterns, finding some justifications. So if we're going to ask which of the 4 components you're confident in, let's switch it up. Let's go to the next one. And which of the 4 components do you think you need to be a little bit more mindful of as far as either giving time to, or giving time to do it, or maybe even just include it with your instruction? Let's see how we work out with this. Which one of those do you have to be more mindful of? Yeah. Cool. So let me just make sure that we see this. So yes, not surprising. Instruction, absolutely, a little bit more mindful of the time limits. We have to kind of set our own clocks, put a little timer, use a little egg timer if you have to give yourself some idea of how long you've been talking. But the other thing is closure. We often forget face-to-face and online that we have to have some kind of closure that summarizes our learning, especially for math. Let's review how that connected to other learnings that we had. What did we do today? Let's review our steps. We have to have that closure of the instruction because we open it up, we close it. Same thing. Whoops. So going back to our PowerPoint slides, 4 components with instructional ideas. So now we've talked about the 4 components. Now we're going to match up some instructional ideas with those components. I want you to be able to jot down some ideas either that are shown on the screen or even your own. So we're going to start to match up now. What do I do as a teacher that matches up some of the 4 components? For your introduction, for math, let's start connecting those ideas to what we have already learned. Oftentimes in math, kids think each lesson is its own separate identity. we need to pause in our instruction and say, this is how this concept relates to what we have already learned, right? If it's a new task, that introduction might be a little bit lengthy because we have to show how this fraction relates to a whole number. We might have to review that a little bit. I would suggest strongly for your online lessons, you have at least one success criteria. Because if you have a good success criteria in your introduction, you're going to have a natural closer. Absolutely correct. If you got an introduction and you have a success criteria that at the end of my lesson, I can do this, at your closure, you can say, thumbs up. How many people do you feel that they were successful with this? Or you have some kind of conversation starter that you can check in with kids because it relates back to that success criteria. It's a natural opener and a natural closer. For your instruction, direct instruction is going to follow the I do, we do. And then in your interaction, you're going to overlap some we do with you do. Now, if you're going to do an inquiry-based lesson, again, you may have a word problem up the board, and here's the trick. Take off that final question. Ask the kids to look at the word problem, inquiry-based. What do you notice about the word problem? What do you think the math is in the word problem? What would be good questions to ask in regards to the word problem? So again, if your instruction is going to expand or contract, depending if you're doing direct instruction or inquiry-based, but the component is still going to be there. Whoops, yeah. Interaction. How are you going to have the kids engage with the material you just taught them? Here's a little trick, I think, for interaction. Kind of map out for yourself as teachers, if I use chat, how am I going to use that? How am I going to use thumbs up, thumbs down? How might I use something like poll everywhere? If you have older students, you might be able to do that. The trick for online, I think right now, is consistency, so that you can always say, I'm going to ask you a factual-based question, like I'm going to ask you, what's 3 times 4? And I want everyone to type in the chat room what their answer is, right? You want to keep those kids engaged. Every time you do a chat, a poll, or show a visual, it respikes that primacy attention cycle. Your closure, summarize your learning. Some good self-assessment questions are, what did you learn today? Have them repeat back to you what they've learned. How could our learning get better? In what ways were we successful? You should have already established in your online forum, here's my online learning expectations, correct? So if we have that in a face-to-face classroom, our behavior expectations and what a good learner looks like, we should have our online, what does a good learner do or look like online? And so it allows the students to come back and remind themselves, just because we're online doesn't mean our teacher does not have behavioral expectations and learning expectations of us. And then you can always say, what are some ways that we did well today? And what are some we can maybe improve for tomorrow? Always come back to your learning success criteria. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Here's my success criteria. How many think they were successful today? And so it's a real nice closure to that whole learning cycle, the 4 components. So let's review for ourselves. Here's the summary of our quick little tidbit today. Mini lesson, 4 components: introduction, instruction, interaction, and closure. Instructional techniques for your introduction. Connect to prior instruction. Don't forget to do that. Just because you're online doesn't mean we forget about good teaching. Specific learning tasks. If you haven't used success criteria, I would ask you to start exploring that. Some I can statements. If you have 20 minutes of instruction, you should be able to get at least one simple I can statement out of that. Start with one. Let those kids leave your online session feeling successful. Direct instruction is going to probably be your instruction right now. If you're used to doing inquiry-based instruction, absolutely use that. Don't forget, in your instruction, you might be able to find online a short video that talks about equivalent fractions, a short video that talks about exponents. UDL says multiple means of representation. you're going to need a little video once in a while, right, to get across the concept to those students who are more visual than they are auditory learners. So remember that. You can include that in your instruction. Interaction. What is the interaction going to be with the materials that you have for the kids? How are they going to explore the task? How are they going to develop complexity with the task? That's your interaction. And your closure. Oftentimes we forget this face-to-face. We forget this online also. So remember to have your closure. A student's self-assessment is really kind of cool. Get those kids used to saying to you in math class, hey, I don't understand this. Right? Oftentimes we forget to that. We have to almost kind of award and reward students for making a mistake and being honest that I don't understand that, because through misunderstanding, we learn better once we do the correction. So again, student self-assessment, one of my districts I worked with had 3 cards. Kids got a red card, a yellow card, and a green card. At the end of a mini task or a mini lesson, teacher asks, show me your card. Where's your level of understanding? Red means I need teacher's help. Yellow means I can learn from a friend. Green means I'm good to go. I can start my homework independently or my independent task. And what was really cool to watch was over the course of time, students became extremely honest. Like it was okay and very accepted if you put up your red card. And then the teacher would gather them as a small group. Depending on your online format, you could do the same thing. If you become comfortable with Zoom and breakout rooms, maybe you can assign kids to a small breakout room, or have a different Zoom session where I'm going to meet with all you guys, come into here for about 10 minutes. So there's different ways you can play with that depending on your online format. But self-assessment in a closure is a great idea. So again, those are your 4 components. What's going to change most likely is going to be the time that you give to each of those components. Structure is key. It's essential for creating security and stability in the learning environment, whether it's face-to-face or online. But teachers have to remember that we can't get lockstep into spending the same amount of time on all of the components, because that's when the clock gets you and that's when your online time will catch you. So again, plan out 4 components. How are you going to divide the time with the lessons that you have coming up? So we're going to now gather you back into breakout rooms. I think Scott's going to help me out with that. Here's your success criteria for our session. Can you name all 4 components of the mini lesson that you're going to use within your math teaching? Can you give some instructional examples of what each of those 4 components might entail you to deliver as the instructor? Or what are you going to allow students to do? And can you explain to me what's going to change within that mini lesson structure? What is going to be the variable, and how might that variable be affected? What might be some causes and effects that you can think of? So when Scott puts you into small groups, I'm going to have you check with each other, make sure everyone can make a statement about those 3 success criteria, make sure everyone's confident, and then after 4 minutes, we're going to bring you back into whole group and we can close up. How does that sound?
All right, sounds good.
Just stop my share.
All right, we're going to do breakout rooms here. 4 minutes and we'll bring everyone back together. Just
Sure.
hit yes
Well,
when you hit yes. Here we go.
okay.